it gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker who will be talking about comparative case studies and non-experimental impact evaluation design. So it's the first webinar that we have on non-experimental designs. And that speaker is Dr. Delwyn Goodrick. Delwyn is a Pakeha Nse, so that's a New Zealander, and she can tell you a little bit more about it, who has over 25 years experience in research and program evaluation. She undertakes evaluations of policy and program areas for government agencies, mainly in Australia, New Zealand and Singapore, but also has a very strong interest in evaluation capacity building. So that's why we have her here telling us about comparative case studies. She's currently involved in multimodal state-level evaluations of Aboriginal social and emotional wellbeing initiatives and Aboriginal child placement in out-of-home care. So without further ado, I will hand over to Delwyn for a webinar on comparative case studies. Thank you, Delwyn.
Great. Thank you so much, Nicola, and thank you to everybody for signing in. As Nicola said, from various diverse places around the globe, but at different time frames. It's about dinner time here for me in the Gold Coast in Queensland in Australia, and so I know that some of you, unfortunately, won't be as good a time as I've got, but thank you so much for dropping in. Now, I just wanted to check that you can see the video at the moment and the sound's okay. Can we just check that? Hello? Yes, great. Yes, great. Okay. I may turn the video off a little bit later as I start to present, because sometimes the system has a bit of trouble catching up, and so that's great. So I can see all your comments there, thank you, and I can see little photos, which makes it so much more personal than talking into a screen. Well, as Nicola said, I'm a Pakeha New Zealander. That means a non-Indigenous New Zealander who has actually lived and worked in Australia for probably half my life now. I started life off as a psychologist, and then went into teaching psychology, research methods, program evaluation, and then started to go into the public sector working in health program evaluation. After a few years doing that, I did some large-scale team-based evaluation work at a university, and then about 6 to 8 years ago I became an independent evaluation consultant, and there's a whole range of reasons why I made that choice, but we can talk about that at another time. One of the great things about my role is that I get to choose to work in various places with really interesting topics and things that I heartily care about, and that primarily is social justice oriented programs that are intended to make a difference, like the type that you are involved with UNICEF. So let's get cracking on the webinar, and as Nicola pointed out, this is actually the first non-experimental impact evaluation approach that we are actually having a webinar on, and it's comparative case studies. As you know, there hasn't been a strong history of evaluation work that has understood the value of case studies, and particularly comparative case studies for causal attribution. And so the focus of this webinar today is to hopefully illuminate some of the ways that I think and that others think comparative case studies can be incredibly valuable, particularly when randomized control trials or quasi-experimental designs or a priori control of particular variables or programs or communities just isn't possible. And in my experience, that's probably most of the time. So what I used to believe was perhaps the gold standard in my training as a psychologist, when I actually hit the real world of programs, policies and implementation, I discovered some of those designs don't work very well. Well, they don't work very well in the real world. They don't give us the answers that we're looking for. So you can see on the second slide just a bit of the range of different evaluation briefs and videos and webinars that are available to you, as Nicola pointed out, which is just awesome, I think. I hope you can understand my accent okay. It is a bit of a hybrid between New Zealand and Australia, but I will make sure that I speak clearly and that I speak concisely and with as little inflection as I possibly can. My slides are, there's a lot of words on the slides, and that's primarily because I wanted to make sure that anybody perhaps that wasn't following along with the message in my voice could actually read the slide. So let's start off with what we're talking about when we're talking about non-experimental approaches for impact evaluation. Most of our work and the work that we care about is making a difference to children's lives, to communities, to governance, and to social betterment. And because UNICEF is implementing programs and conducting and monitoring programs, we actually want to know that we're making a difference. And that's about causal attribution. And because if we're doing impact evaluation, causal attribution is at the heart of what we're trying to do. Now, comparative case studies, our focus for today, are actually really useful for helping us addressing causal questions. In my training, I was told that anything like case studies, any qualitative approaches, surveys, anything other than randomized control trials were not helpful in addressing causal questions. So I was given an impression there was one way. And what I've learned, I guess, from practice is that one way doesn't mean it's the only way. There are often multiple ways to get at something that we want to do, particularly when we're talking about causal attribution, particularly when we're talking about social programs where we can't control for implementation. We can't, it's often staggered. And what's really interesting is there are people involved. You know, we're not amoebas in a test tube that are being poked around. We're implementing programs for people with people who have agency and choice about how they respond to programs. And so to me, comparative case studies can be a really useful way to think about how and why do particular policies or programs work, or why don't they work? How come they work in one place? Basically the same model, it's being implemented with fidelity, but it works in one area of the Sudan and it doesn't work in another area of Southeast Asia. What's that about? Well, to me, that's about context. And that's why I think a lot of randomized control trials and quasi-experimental designs in their traditional sense haven't really taken into account the role of context. They've looked at variables in the way they relate to each other, but they haven't looked at what is it about that those people in place in community and programs that have enabled them to make a difference or not make a difference. So there are lots of different strategies for causal attribution, and you have been exposed to one that is very dominant, which is the counterfactual. What would have happened if this program or policy had not been implemented? And the randomized control trial, where we control for as many variables as we can in the implementation, and the control population is certainly, or multiple treatments and multiple control, and in treatment populations and in non-treatment, that counterfactual is just one way to start to get at the issue of causal attribution. And what the series has argued is there are at least 3 ways. We know at least dominantly 3 ways. And the other 2 ways are particularly relevant to the comparative case study. And so that's what we'll be looking at. To start off with, we wanted to make this as interactive as we could. And so we've got a little poll that we'd like to ask you to do. And what Nicola's going to do is she's going to take over from me and she's going to raise the poll, and then I'm going to see all your comments in the left-hand margin, which is very exciting. So we'll start off perhaps with that, and I will allow Nicola to do her thing. Thanks, Nicola.
Okay, everyone, so you should see the poll in front of you. Have there been case studies in an evaluation you've done, managed or used? So, yep, some of you are already answering. So all the multiple choice responses have a button to the left. So just if you could click your response on whichever answer is most relevant to you, so that Delwyn has a good idea of the level of engagement with case studies that her audience has. So Delwyn, you can see the responses.
Yeah. Yeah, that's awesome. That's great. I'm taking back over.
Just to maybe give it a little bit longer. We've had about 12 responses, 13. So, and there is 18 people online. So if any of you haven't responded yet, maybe do so. Okay, so I'll just read out what we have. We have most of our respondents, 53%, saying yes, they have done one or two. 35% no, but be interested to learn. And 12%, well, two, say lots. So you have two experts online. But I'm happy to see that nobody said no, I don't think they are likely to be useful.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so over to you.
That would be a bit odd. Right. That would be a little bit odd if someone was online going, no, they're not useful, but I'm here giving up my evening or my morning. So thank you so much for responding to that. It's great to see the numbers come up, although, the percentages are obviously not that meaningful when we've got such a small number. But it is great to see that you folk have either used, most of you have used, or you've seen some opportunity to use case studies. There's a follow-up question now, which is just for the people that have used. So, that's the folk, and Nicola's getting that ready for you now.
Okay, so hopefully you can see that on your screen. So the follow-up question is, for those that have used case studies, how have case studies mostly been used in evaluations you've done, managed, or used? So number 1, to inform evaluation design before quantitative data collection and to identify issues. Number 2, for descriptive or illustrative purposes to describe the context in which a program took place. And number 3, for explanatory purposes to investigate whether or not and how a program has worked. And we've got 6 responses where 5 people have said for explanatory purposes. So to investigate whether or not and how a program has worked. And 6 people say for descriptive or illustrative purposes, but no one to inform the evaluation design. So I hope that gives you some idea of the audience, and over to you again, Delwyn.
That's great, thank you. And I see John's just posted a comment on there, a little bit between the two, which is awesome. And actually, probably John, quite common. So let's now go to the next slide. Now, how do I get back to the slide? Back to my slide.
So manage presentable content and press on the PowerPoint presentation.
Present now. It's saying the presentation was stopped. That's not good. Oh, okay. Here we go. Here we go. I think this is it. Yes?
It's loading on our screen, so yes, it will come up. So continue presenting.
Great. Thank you so much.
But we are on slide 1, so you might need to just move it forward a bit.
I'll move it forward to where we're at. So, great. So thank you for responding to the poll. And I think it illustrates a really important point. And the point is that people talk about case studies in very different ways. And I wanted to give you an example of this from a job that I actually tendered for and was successful in getting in 2010. So this was an evaluation of a very large statewide program that was about Aboriginal people and well-being, social and emotional well-being, and giving them more of a role in governance and leadership within the community, but within politics more broadly, so within our system of politics. So a very, very important piece of work. And in the RFQ, or the request for quotation, this was the summary of the 4 major components that they were interested in. They said they wanted an achievement overview, an outcome evaluation, and then they said, and I've highlighted this, they wanted case studies. And they said we want at least 4 profiles of program sites, examples of who's involved, what they've done, what impact programmers' involvement had had on them, and their role within the community. So what I'm interested here in, if you think about that description, what are they talking about in terms of case studies? Are they talking about comparative case studies, multiple case studies, single profiles of case studies that are used for description or analysis of similarities and differences between these program sites. It wasn't clear from the RFQ, and when we went to the interview, we had to actually sharpen the client's understanding of what type of case study they were talking about. This, to me, is illustrative of a real issue in case study evaluation and research more generally. And that is that of a lot of the methods, I think, case study is one of the most ambiguous often in meaning. People will say a case study is an insert box in an evaluation report. Oh, we included a case study. What their meaning is an insert box of a story of change or an experience within a particular program site. That, to me, is not the definition of a case study. So they're using the term case study as a representational or a presentation device, as doctors, lawyers, dentists do in the case study of the patient. But they're not meaning it in the sense that social scientists are often thinking about when we talk about case studies as a method or a design framework. Now, what the implication of that is that if we're not really clear about what we mean by case study, descriptive case study, illustrative case study, comparative case study, collective case study, etc., then the confusion could actually limit their usefulness in impact evaluation. And I think this is what has happened in a lot of the examples that I've reviewed and a lot of the work that I've done in conceptualizing comparative case study work. So let's have a look at what my definition is, and I guess what are some of the differences between those types of approaches. And I kind of, with the poll, was explicitly general so that we could hopefully bring these kinds of things out. So often case study is seen as it's an in-depth understanding of something. We're looking into a particular policy, we're looking at processes, context, outcomes, and we are looking at those case studies over time. Some people will talk about them being particularistic, the intrinsically interesting case of the country that managed to achieve great things in an area where others haven't. There is another type of case study that is often talked about in our literature, but also in the type of work evaluators do, and this is very common, and these are your collective or multiple case studies. And Robert State's written a lot of very interesting multiple where he's described, defined, and looked at similarities and differences. Oh yes, I'll turn my camera off. Thank you. I just got some great feedback. Thank you. It's easier for me too. Collective or multiple case studies, we're actually using a number of case studies to describe or illustrate implementation or potentially differences in outcomes over the course of a evaluation. And then we have the comparative case study. Now, comparative case studies have a very long history in political science particularly. And political scientists, as we know, often are trying to understand why crises happened between democratic countries, or why the Cuban Missile Crisis occurred, or why leadership changes were brought about, and they can't study them prospectively. So to me, this is a very similar issue to a lot of evaluations. We're unable to design ahead like the randomized control trial asks us to. We're unable to actually define ahead of time what those issues might be. We're actually retrospectively looking back often at implementation and saying, what was it about that program that worked in place in that way in that time? So comparative case studies have a fairly new, they're fairly new in program evaluation. There's only a few published refereed journal articles anyway about the use of comparative case studies. That's growing all the time. It's an amazing area of growth. What comparative case study tries to do, unlike the other two examples of and test causal questions. So we select the case studies as tests, so that a very strong theory that we may have developed from program theory or our logic maps or theory of change, and we actually select cases on the basis that they are a test of that theory. Now let's look at that a little bit more, and I'll whiz over the first couple of slides and get straight to the comparative case study. But when we think of a lot of single case studies or single focused dimension case studies, they're often used for a descriptive purpose. You know, this is what's happening in implementation and outcomes in this particular area. And we're really interested in that, and they're incredibly valuable because they give outsiders an understanding. Sorry, I've just had some feedback. I'm trying to get closer to my mic. Hopefully that's a little better. Thank you, Nicola. We are trying to get an understanding of the specificities of the case, and we're trying to often showcase that particular country or community in an evaluation report. So that's a type of case study. The second type, the collective case study, very common in evaluation, is one where we've got lots of different case studies. And my own PhD in '99 was a collective case study. It wasn't for causal purposes. It wasn't to generate explanations of particular outcome patterns. Rather, it was trying to understand how something was in place. And this particular topic was about the issue of validity and valuing in program evaluation. So the cases were selected purposefully rather than probabilistically. So they were selected for a purpose of showcasing or illustrating the concept of validity or valuing. They were not, however, for causal attribution. The third type, which we're saying is the type we're focusing on with comparative case studies, and that front-end comparative is a really critical inclusion here, is that this is a collective case study, so it's 2 or more cases. But what we're trying to do with the cases is we're testing out some causal questions that we have developed from our. We're trying to understand how different configurations or patterns are produced through those cases. So we do know from our work, and I'm sure I'll see some, well, I won't see, but I'll feel that you're nodding your heads, or you may be nodding, hopefully, is that often we might have a program model and it's being implemented across a range of different countries or a range of different sites. And gee, the model has fidelity, but there's completely different outcomes in those different communities. Or we find that we're implementing different things and we have similar outcomes that are produced from a range of different interventions. So there's often a multifaceted or multi-programmatic, multimodal implementation series that's generating different causal outcomes. So what case studies do, unlike the randomized control trial or quasi-experimental design, is they allow us to try and explain for those different outcome configurations. They help us to identify where there are patterns of interest that relate to our very strong theoretical framing from our program theory or theory of change. And then we use the selection of cases to test those propositions across the various cases that we are using in our study. So this is a case-oriented strategy, not a variable-oriented strategy. Sometimes in workshops people will say, well, how different is this to regression, for example, or particular statistical techniques that are looking at the number of different patterns or their relationship to each other to explain an outcome. And the difference is these are a smaller number of cases. We wouldn't often be able to do the types of statistical analyses with a small number of cases of countries or communities. But the purpose is it's not focusing on the variables, it's focusing together or independently to create the change that we are observing. So unfortunately, we are in a evaluated comparative case study. Only way. My experience, I'm sure your experience, is that would almost rule out almost everything that we do in communities and programs and policies. We can't control for implementation ahead of time. We can't often control the way that the program or policy rolls out. We want to understand how context is being used, or I'm just getting some feedback here about sound. I'm not sure what to do. I've turned the video off. So, Nicola, I wonder if
There is not a whole lot you can do except speak as close to the microphone as you can.
Yep. Okay. I'm as close as I've almost got my nose against the screen, so I'm really glad the video is not on. Right. So I've got my nose very close to the. Oh, then where is that? It's coming back. Sorry. I had my nose so close I think I might have hit a button. So I'm going to have to just whiz forward again a little bit while I keep talking. So I'm talking as close as I possibly can and as loud as I can. So I'm sorry if it sounds to some people like I'm shouting. I'm certainly not trying to do that. So let's talk about the point that I was making, which is, unfortunately, case studies are often seen as a poor cousin to some of these designs that I was talking about that are common in impact evaluation. However, in the experience of many people I've spoken to, in real programs and policies, we can't control for implementation ahead of time. We can't often easily understand the types of variables that we might be looking at. We often are implementing across multiple contexts that are different in different ways, staggered implementation, and we want to understand context because we know context makes a difference. So I think comparative case studies gives us another option, another alternative to those types of designs that we've been told are the only way or the narrow way to generate causal claims. So the key features of comparative case studies are 4 major key features. One is there's that iteration or development between theory data collection and iterative cycles of data collection. So that means we don't just have 4 countries where we're implementing a program and say, there's our 4 case studies. We actually say which are the cases that are theoretically of interest for us to test the claims or the theories of change that we've identified in our program logic or our theory of change diagrams or outcome hierarchy. We are using the logic model or the theory of change to actually help us to understand what are the types of cases that would be most useful for us. And we may build on other cases further down the study. We may not choose all the cases in advance. The second point is a lot of practitioners will think that case studies are only qualitative. Well, in fact, comparative case studies and a lot of multiple case studies will include mixed methods of data collection, both qualitative and quantitative data. And the key element here, I think, is the third one. The selection of the cases has to be theoretically informed. So we are making decisions that have to be explicit in our evaluation reports about how and why particular cases were selected. And that may mean choosing the successful cases. It may mean choosing a case and generating an explanation about what were the features that seem to be most present that are related to the outcome in relation to our program, and then choosing a case that has also been successful where those configuration of patterns were not present. So we are using the case study selection to help us to robustly test our theories. The fourth element that I think is really an opportunity for us is comparative case analysis, or comparative case studies have opportunities for different types of analytic strategy. So we'll often use techniques like process tracing or qualitative comparative analysis, seeking alternative explanations, looking for discrepant cases and using those as a test, and many other strategies that I'll be talking about a bit later in the webinar. So this diagram, which is also in the evaluation brief that you may all have with you, is a 6-step, if you like, a very simplified 6-step, how do I design a comparative case study. And of course the first two, or the first one, is pretty obviously would be relevant for any design that we're choosing or any method. But the second one is that strongly, explicitly theory-informed approach to the evaluation. a theory-based approach or theory-informed approach using a theory of change or program logic model, not just as a front-end type of the evaluation, which logic models are often used as a here's what we'll look at, here's our performance measures, but actually used to generate propositions about change so that we can test them in the case studies. Then we select the type of cases that we're actually going to include, and that of course will be dependent on time, resources. This comparative case studies, like randomized control trials and other methods, are very time intensive and often require a lot of that front end planning but work along the way. So while we may have a small number of cases, sometimes we'll have a large number of observations about those cases. Whereas sometimes when we've got a large number of cases, we're obviously going to be limited to a much smaller, limited range of things that we're going to explore, and I think that's a key point. Number 4 is that we have to devise our methods of data collection. What are the most appropriate methods that we can use to collect evidence? Now, some of these could be secondary data that's already available. In fact, Robert Yin, who's one of the most cited authors on case studies and social research, argues that often we can undertake case studies, comparative case studies, or in his view, collective case studies that have an explanatory purpose. We can do these with almost entirely from our desk, rather than desktop evidence. To me, this depends on the quality of the evidence that's available. If there isn't good evidence, you're not going to be able to pull off a comparative case study very well. So again, this speaks to good implementation processes and real thoughtfulness about our programs. So we've got to choose methods, often qualitative and quantitative methods, field visits, observation, focus group discussions, secondary data, document analysis. These are all the types of methods and techniques that might be valuable. And then we are using those to start to consider and test some of those explanations that we have identified from step 3. And this can lead us sometimes to new data collection in terms of identification of other sites or cases, as the case may be. And here we're talking about cases as either entities, programs, people, groups, or in fact things like implementation processes. I mean, events can also be cases. They're not just limited to the entity, which is again a misnomer of case studies. We can choose events as the case. And then after we've done that subsequent testing of explanations, we'll report the findings and hopefully people will be happy. No, I shouldn't say that. Everybody will be happy. No, what usually happens when we're reporting findings is in that synthesis process, we may be actually going back and generating new data, or in fact identifying new cases that become apparent as we're developing our report. So that's sort of 6 very simple steps, and of course the devil's in the detail in terms of how we might do that. So let's go to the next slide here, which is about how we select the cases. And I've already emphasised, I think, that cases have to be carefully selected. This is not about we're implementing this in 5 school districts or 5 different communities, therefore we're having 5 case studies. This is about selecting the case studies that are of most theoretical relevance given your program theory. We may have embedded units of analysis. So often, I'm sure in your context, we might have programs or policies that are implemented in countries, but then within those countries, there are obviously schools, districts, health centres, districts and boards that might be implementing different elements of our programs. And we might actually want to understand those embedded units within the overall case. We will often, as I mentioned in the previous slide or referred to in the previous slide, we'll select a few cases as tests up front, but then we'll evolve our case selection as we analyse the data. So often comparative case studies, the data collection and the analysis, particularly if staggered over time, helps us to generate some insights that we can then test in subsequent cases. So we might obviously not select all of the cases up front because we actually have to learn from the synthesis process which cases might be most relevant to test. In the evaluation that I used as an example on about the third slide, where I said there was little understanding of case study, one of the things that we generated was that over the time of the evaluation, which was only 8 months in total, we were able to generate propositions from earlier cases, test them through an analysis process called qualitative comparative analysis, look for the conditions that seem to be present in the successful local Indigenous networks, but also look for evidence of conditions that weren't present in successful local Indigenous networks, and the corollary, which is also the opposite, where was there not in success, but where those things weren't present. So that sounds a bit confusing. So I'll just say that quickly again. We're looking to test to see what kind of configuration of factors, or I guess traditionally we would call those independent variables, but not in my language. We would call them conditions that might be responsible for the outcome that we're interested in. We were then able to develop a report that showed the client that in these particular local Indigenous networks, they were much more effective in being able to generate effective governance and effective leadership because they had these attributes, and that these other cases that didn't have these particular attributes were less likely to be able to do that or unable to do that. So again, the qualitative and quantitative data was very powerful. As a policy maker, our policy decision makers loved that evidence because they were able to say, how do we then better support these Indigenous networks to be more effective in building the capacity of their community? So we will often have anywhere between 2 and 20 cases or more, up to 200 arguably, but obviously you're having to make trade-offs between breadth and depth. The higher number of cases, the less depth you'll actually be able to generate in terms of the contextual information about those cases. The smaller number of cases, the much more observational evidence or evidence data collection you might require to be able to compare and contrast. However, there are balances in breadth and depth, and I guess I myself have a preference toward depth and understanding of meaning and context rather than 200 cases where I really don't get a sense of what was it about that context that made or didn't make a difference. And then, of course, our case selection enables us to test our propositions so that we can then decide, do we modify them, do we reject them, do we actually use the cases to clarify them. One really key part, I think, of a good comparative case study is a case study protocol. And the case study protocol is really linked, again, to Robert Yin's work, where he talks about the importance of any collective case studies being highly systematic, and this is about rigor. And what this means is that if people or practitioners or agents are going out to particular sites or countries, or they're undertaking case studies within multiple countries or sites, that they have to have some level of comparison in terms of the type of data that you're collecting. Now, interestingly, just this morning I had an email from someone who's working in South America who has had the dilemma of somebody insisting that they have to collect data in their own way because their community is unique. And she was sort of pulling her hair out about this, saying, well, I want to do really good comparative work, but they're going to make up different questions. They're going to be using different questions they think are relevant that might not be relevant to the comparative case. And so my point here is there needs to be some commonality in process. That doesn't mean identical question sequence. It doesn't mean identical questions, but it means that the purpose is very clear for the question, and that obviously there might be differences in literacy or the way that we need to frame questions or comments or the materials we need to provide, but that we are systematic in the way that we go about doing that, and that we have an understanding up front of the type of data that's needed, whether that's processes for entry into particular communities, support letters, ethical issues or protocols, but also obviously how the data is going to be used. So I think a case study protocol serves two really important purposes. It makes sure that when your readers of your report read your report, they can see that this was not ad hoc, this was not people going out communing with communities and having a chat. This was actually about, which arguably is very relevant by the way, but this was, these chats or yarns were with a purpose, and they were understood within a broader, that each of the site visitors, each of the site evaluators had a clear role in reasoning for the types of questions that they asked, so that we can make some comparisons down the track. The three key analytic processes, I think, in any comparative case study is being able to describe what we're seeing or hearing or observing or finding out, that we can compare it within the case but also across cases, and that we can relate those cases to dimensions of interest, our theory of change, theories that we have about how our programs or policies are supposed to work. So there's 4 different ways that we can do that, and I'm aware of the time, so I'm going to look through these pretty quickly. We can look at comparing across dimensions on different programs. So we might have believed or had a theory that leadership and governance are important critical factors to a particular outcome or chain of outcomes occurring in a particular community. So we might look at governance or leadership across our different programs, across different cases and contexts. We could also look directly at outcomes, go straight to the outcomes and say, well, which countries, communities achieved and which didn't, and how did that relate to our theory about how change occurred, so we can compare the attributes that they have with the actual outcomes from those that were successful. Or we can compare responses of particular stakeholders or groups of stakeholders within a single program, understand those, then compare them across programs, or we could obviously use some type of comparison of stakeholders over time. Now these are just 4 different possibilities, and I guess putting them up is to suggest that comparative case studies are about comparison and relationships. So what are the things that you're going to be comparing your programs or policies on, and what are the things or dimensions that you're interested in comparing the cases on? There's a number of different analytic strategies for qualitative comparative for comparative case studies, which I briefly referred to earlier in the webinar. And in fact, in the brief, there's a brief mention in the brief about 2 of these particular promising strategies. If you look at the slide, you'll probably think, gee, this looks like sort of numbers on a slide. These are just examples of truth tables, which is a product of qualitative comparative analysis, which is a really promising analytic strategy for comparative case study. So what qualitative comparative analysis does in brief is it's very theoretically informed. We develop our, if you like, our conditions that we think are responsible or will be responsible for program success or outcomes, and then we look across our cases for their presence or absence, or their degree of presence or absence, and then this information is minimized and analyzed through a truth table, which is basically a table that looks at the outcome and then the conditions that are present or absent that may be there or may not have been there for that outcome to occur. A computer package, and you can use a number of different packages for this. In vivo is possible, but there's also a specific computer program called Tosmana that enables qualitative comparative analysis, which is quite straightforward. We can look at these collations, not correlations necessarily, but we look at which factors seem to be necessary and or sufficient on their own to produce an outcome. So I'm not going to go into any more detail than that, and to be honest, I've only actually used this process twice, so I don't think I could go into too much more detail. Process tracing, the other one to briefly mention, the best analogy for process tracing is the detective. Sherlock Holmes or a detective that will go back and retroductively try and put evidence together to work out how come something happened. some cases that could be a burglary or an act of violence. How was it that that occurred? And so the Sherlock Holmes principle, or the process trace, tries to put that evidence together to argue for a particular sequence of events that then led to the particular outcome. And I think a lot of us do this, you know, in using case studies or qualitative data anyway. I just don't think sometimes we've had the real analytic techniques to help us do this. So these two techniques are incredibly valuable. Again, pattern matching is akin to matching patterns that we're identifying with other patterns of similar or difference in different contexts. These strategies, I think, show real promise for actually thinking much more broadly than a plain thematic analysis or a content analysis of case study material. Just on the last part, and then I'll finish up the questions, is what are some options for presenting comparative case studies? I think the biggest challenge, and it continues to be a challenge for me, is I want to balance the depth of information with what the decision makers want, which is I want to know, did it work or not, how did it work, and what should we do next time to get it to work better? I mean, those three big questions. And sometimes because of the depth of comparative case study data, particularly when you've got small n, you know, a small number of cases, I have found some clients aren't really interested in the depth and detail. They just want to get to the table that says, yes, this worked and this is how and this is what we need to do. To me, the richness of the data and the narrative description that I'm including is actually part of a really important part of the story, because it's showing the context and what that means. And that's why I'm out there collecting that data. That's why you're out there observing in different communities, because you actually think there's something about being there and connecting with interviews, focus group discussions, observations that you're not going to get from secondary data and you're not going to get from surveys. Literacy issues aside, we actually believe that there is worth and value in being able to interpret meaning together with others. And to me, that's why I think comparative case studies powerfully should have some level of rich narrative description so that we can highlight to our evaluation audiences similarities and differences across contexts. I will, however, often use tables or matrices, summary tables of over time, showing change over time across cases or factors that I believe from the evidence contributed to particular changes. And I'll use triangulation of evidence from interviews and other evidence to help me to make those claims and to make sure they're robust. And of course, then we could also use illustrations or diagrammatic representations of relationships between and among the dimensions that we're looking at. But at the end of the day, we're going to have to make some decisions about the needs of the audience versus the very rich evidence base that we get from comparative case studies. Some things to avoid if you're using comparative case studies. One is, I guess, that the issue that I mentioned earlier. We're not doing comparative case studies if you just thought, yep, I'll just pick some cases. The other, I think, important point is that we are not just doing multiple case studies where we're selecting, you know, by some sampling, whether it's purposive or probabilistic sampling. We're not just saying, well, let's pick 9 out of 12 or, you know, 5 out of 20. We're doing it from a strong theory of change basis, or from a strong propositional basis. We make sure that in comparative case studies, we're not just saying, oh, there were similarities and differences here. You know, we've all done that. Oh, yes, this group's different from that group. That's not what this is about. This is about saying there are these outcomes that we want to be able to explain. It's not just what is similar and different. It leaves, I think, an audience really hanging because they want to know, well, so what? Now what? You've said there are differences between communities. Well, we knew that. What are the things that they hold or share in common? And if you think back to the national, I mean, you know, the crisis, the economic crisis, we called it a crisis because it shared something in common that we can get a handle on. But of course, there were lots of unique explanations about how that crisis occurred. So that's what I mean about we've got to focus on that attention to explanation. And again, low-level comparisons. If you've got poor evidence, perhaps this is not the approach that might be ideal. Maybe there are other approaches that, or perhaps those that don't purport to generate causal claims. So just to finish off, and time for questions, I believe, and I wouldn't be doing this webinar or the brief if I didn't, that comparative case studies are a really robust approach to evaluation. Most of the work that I am involved in has causal questions, and if I didn't think comparative case studies could pull it off, I probably wouldn't be an evaluator, because I certainly am in favour of mixed methods of data collection and analysis, and I'm very strong for the value of interpreted qualitative data. The second point, we can undertake comparative case studies concurrently or with the program or retrospectively, looking back on the program. So that's very relevant for those of us that perhaps have a good evidence base but have to look and do some retrofitting backwards. There are a couple of other points there that I won't belabor, but there is a last call to action, which is there aren't many good examples of comparative case studies in the actual published literature. I'm sure they're being done. They're being in the grey literature, or they're being internal programs that aren't releasing evaluation reports like some of the clients that I work with in Australia. But there's an opportunity here for us to do and work in this space, and I'd be very excited to hear what you think about that, and maybe open to some questions. Thank you.